The dusty winds of 1887 swept across the barren landscape of Nevada Territory as Margaret O'Sullivan clutched the worn deed in her trembling hands. The 42-year-old widow had traveled 3,000 miles from Boston, carrying nothing but a carpetbag and the desperate hope that her late husband's final gift would provide the fresh start she desperately needed. Thomas had died of consumption 6 months earlier, leaving behind debts that consumed their modest savings and a mysterious inheritance he'd never mentioned during their 20 years of marriage. The ranch house stood before her like a weathered monument to forgotten dreams, its paint peeling away like old skin, revealing the gray wood beneath that had been battered by decades of unforgiving desert storms. Margaret had expected little from the property that Thomas somehow acquired through a poker game with a dying prospector named Jeremiah Walsh. The papers were legitimate, signed and witnessed in Carson City. But the remote location near the California border seemed more like a punishment than a blessing. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the closest town, Dusty Creek, was a 2-hour ride on horseback through treacherous canyon passes. As she pushed open the creaking front door, Margaret wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving the familiar streets of Boston for this godforsaken wilderness, where coyotes howled through the night and rattlesnakes sunned themselves on the front porch. The interior of the house told the story of a man who'd lived alone for too long. Cobwebs draped the corners like funeral shrouds, and a thick layer of dust covered everything from the rough-hewn table to the cast-iron stove that dominated the kitchen. Margaret spent her first week cleaning, scrubbing away years of neglect while trying to ignore the strange sounds that echoed through the walls at night. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps in the attic, other times like whispered conversations drifting up from somewhere beneath the floorboards. She told herself it was just the house settling, the wood expanding and contracting with the dramatic temperature changes between scorching days and frigid nights. On her 8th day in the house, while moving furniture to clean beneath it, Margaret discovered something that made her blood run cold. A section of the kitchen floor sounded hollow when she accidentally dropped her bucket of soapy water. The wooden planks didn't match the rest of the flooring, and when she examined them closely in the lamplight, she could see they'd been cut and fitted back into place with more recent nails than those holding down the surrounding boards. Her late husband had been a carpenter before consumption weakened his lungs, and she recognized quality workmanship when she saw it. Someone had deliberately created a hidden access point beneath the kitchen, and recently enough that the wood hadn't weathered to match the rest of the floor. Margaret spent the next 2 days gathering the courage to investigate further. She'd grown up hearing her Irish grandmother's stories about cursed treasure and vengeful spirits, tales that seemed ridiculous in the gaslit parlors of Boston but felt disturbingly plausible in the isolated Nevada wilderness. Finally, armed with a crowbar she'd found in the barn and her late husband's hunting rifle, she pried up the loose boards. The hollow sound had been accurate. Beneath the kitchen floor, wooden steps descended into a cellar that the house's previous owner had taken great pains to conceal. The air that rose from the opening smelled of earth and something else, something metallic that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. The cellar was larger than she'd expected, extending well beyond the boundaries of the house above. Hand-hewn support beams stretched across a ceiling barely tall enough for her to stand upright, and the walls had been reinforced with stones mortared together with such skill that no moisture seeped through despite the underground location. But what dominated the space were the wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked along the walls with military precision. Each crate bore stenciled numbers and dates ranging from 1878 to 1885, suggesting years of systematic collection. Margaret's hands shook as she used the crowbar to open the first container, expecting to find the usual frontier contraband, stolen cattle brands, bootleg whiskey, or perhaps bags of silver or taken from disputed mining claims. Instead, she found herself staring at neatly bundled stacks of currency, more money than she'd ever seen in one place. But this wasn't just any money. These were freshly printed bills from banks across California, Nevada, and Arizona territory, bearing the crisp edges and unblemished surfaces of notes that had never circulated through normal commerce. Beneath the currency lay leather-bound ledgers filled with dates, amounts, and cryptic notations written in a careful hand. As Margaret flipped through the pages by lamplight, a horrifying pattern emerged. The dates corresponded with newspaper accounts she remembered reading about a series of bank robberies that had terrorized the southwestern territories for nearly a decade. The methodical nature of the record-keeping suggested something far more sophisticated than random banditry. Each entry included details about bank security, employee schedules, and escape routes mapped with the precision of a military campaign. But most disturbing were the personal notes about bank employees and their families, information that could only have been gathered through careful surveillance over extended periods. Margaret realized she wasn't looking at the hideout of a common outlaw, but the headquarters of what appeared to be the most successful criminal organization in territorial history. The legendary Phantom Riders, whose exploits had been chronicled in penny dreadfuls and newspaper headlines across the country, had operated from this very cellar. As she continued exploring the hidden chamber, Margaret discovered evidence of an operation that extended far beyond simple robbery. Maps covered one wall, marked with red pins indicating not just successful heists, but planned routes for moving stolen goods and money through an underground network that stretched from Mexico to Canada. The organization had established safe houses, corrupted local officials, and maintained detailed intelligence on law enforcement activities across multiple territories. But what chilled her most was finding her own late husband's name in one of the ledgers, listed among a network of seemingly legitimate businessmen who had unknowingly helped launder the stolen money through their various enterprises. Thomas had never known the true nature of Jeremiah Walsh's business dealings. The ledger revealed that Walsh had systematically targeted honest merchants and tradesmen, using their legitimate businesses as unknowing fronts for his criminal empire. Her husband's carpentry business had been used to transport stolen currency hidden inside custom-built furniture pieces, delivered to accomplices in distant cities who would then introduce the bills into circulation through seemingly normal commercial transactions. The realization that Thomas had been manipulated into participating in the Phantom Riders operation, even unwillingly, made Margaret's grief transform into something harder and more dangerous. The deeper Margaret dug into the cellar's secrets, the more she understood why Walsh had been so eager to sign over the property during that final poker game. The man hadn't been generous or careless with drink. He'd been dying and desperate to pass along a burden that had grown too heavy for one person to carry. Hidden behind the stacked crates, Margaret found evidence that the Phantom Riders' reign of terror hadn't ended with Walsh's death, as the newspapers had reported. Other members of the organization were still active, still following the detailed plans and utilizing the resources stored in this underground chamber. Recent correspondence, dated just weeks before her arrival, revealed that Walsh's surviving associates expected the property to remain vacant until they could safely retrieve their accumulated wealth. They had no idea that a Boston widow now held legal title to their secret headquarters. The letters discussed plans for a final, massive heist targeting the newly established First National Bank of San Francisco, an operation that would require all the organization's remaining resources and mark their transition from territorial bandits to international criminals. Margaret realized she held not just evidence of past crimes, but intelligence that could prevent a future catastrophe that would dwarf all their previous exploits. The moral weight of her discovery pressed down on Margaret like a physical burden. She could simply take enough money to secure her financial future and pretend she'd never found the rest. The stolen currency would ensure she never faced poverty again, and the territorial authorities had no idea this cash existed. But she also knew that remaining silent would make her complicit in whatever horrors the surviving Phantom Riders planned to unleash upon innocent people. The correspondence made it clear that their final operation would involve violence on a scale that would shock even a frontier society accustomed to brutality. Dozens of bank employees and customers would die to cover their escape. Margaret spent sleepless nights pacing the floors above the hidden cellar, weighing her options while listening to the desert wind howl through the gaps in the walls. She thought about Thomas and how he would have reacted to discovering his unwitting role in the criminal enterprise. Her husband had been a simple, honest man who believed in working hard and treating people fairly. He would never have forgiven himself for contributing to the suffering of innocent families, even unknowingly. The memory of his gentle nature helped Margaret find the strength to make a decision that would change not just her own life, but the fate of everyone who might fall victim to the Phantom Riders' final scheme. The journey to Carson City took Margaret 4 days, riding her husband's old mare through mountain passes still treacherous with spring snowmelt. She carried with her a selection of the most damning documents from the cellar, carefully chosen to provide law enforcement with enough information to take action without revealing the full extent of her discovery. At the territorial courthouse, she requested a meeting with Marshal Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation for honesty had survived 15 years of frontier law enforcement. Morrison listened with growing amazement as Margaret presented evidence that would allow him to solve dozens of unsolved crimes and prevent what could become the most devastating bank robbery in American history. But even as Margaret worked with the authorities to set a trap for the surviving Phantom Riders, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Strange riders appeared on distant ridges, and she occasionally found hoofprints near the house that hadn't been there the night before. The surviving members of the organization had clearly grown suspicious about the delay in accessing their hidden resources. Margaret knew that her decision to involve law enforcement had painted a target on her back, but she also understood that remaining silent would have made her a different kind of victim. The choice between personal safety and moral responsibility had never been more clear or more terrifying. The final confrontation came on a moonless night in late spring, when 3 surviving members of the Phantom Riders arrived at the ranch expecting to find their treasure unguarded and accessible. Instead, they walked into a carefully planned ambush orchestrated by Marshal Morrison and a team of federal agents who had traveled from San Francisco specifically to end the organization's decade-long reign of terror. The gunfight lasted less than 10 minutes, but the sound of rifles echoing through the desert canyons marked the end of the most successful criminal enterprise in territorial history. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as justice finally caught up with men who had caused immeasurable suffering across the American frontier. In the weeks that followed, as federal investigators cataloged the contents of the hidden cellar, Margaret learned the full scope of what she had helped prevent. The Phantom Riders' final plan would have involved not just robbery, but the systematic murder of everyone in the San Francisco bank during the noon rush, when the building would have been crowded with customers conducting their weekly business. The stolen money would have funded the purchase of weapons and explosives for an even larger operation targeting government facilities in Sacramento. Margaret's decision to alert authorities had prevented what could have escalated into something approaching domestic terrorism. The territorial government's reward for information leading to the capture of the Phantom Riders provided Margaret with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But she found herself reluctant to leave the ranch house that had become the center of such extraordinary events. The cellar, now empty of its criminal contents, was converted into a proper root cellar for storing vegetables and preserves. The house itself, after extensive repairs and improvements, became a comfortable home where Margaret could live independently while maintaining correspondence with friends back in Boston, who marveled at her transformation from grieving widow to frontier heroine. The story of the widowed woman who discovered and helped destroy the Phantom Riders' secret headquarters became legend throughout Nevada territory and beyond. But Margaret rarely spoke of those terrifying weeks when she lived above a fortune in stolen money while trying to decide between personal gain and public duty. She understood that her late husband's unwitting involvement in the criminal enterprise had given her a unique opportunity to make amends for crimes he never knew he had helped facilitate. In choosing justice over personal enrichment, she had honored his memory while preventing countless future tragedies. As the desert seasons cycled from scorching summer heat to bitter winter cold and back again, Margaret established herself as a respected member of the sparse frontier community. She used her reward money to help struggling families, support the construction of a schoolhouse in Dusty Creek, and provide loans to honest businessmen looking to establish legitimate enterprises in the growing territory. The woman who had arrived in Nevada carrying nothing but grief and desperation became a symbol of moral courage and community leadership that inspired others to choose difficult righteousness over easy corruption. Years later, when Nevada achieved statehood and Dusty Creek had grown into a proper town with paved streets and electric lighting, Margaret would occasionally receive visitors seeking to hear first-hand accounts of her confrontation with the Phantom Riders. She would serve them tea in her comfortable parlor and tell the story with the measured cadence of someone who had lived through extraordinary events but refused to romanticize the very real terror and moral complexity of those desperate weeks. Her tale served as a reminder that ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances could choose to be heroes, but only by accepting the substantial risks that came with doing what was right instead of what was easy. The old ranch house stands to this day, its cellar now filled with preserves and winter vegetables instead of stolen currency and criminal plans. Margaret's great-grandchildren visit occasionally, marveling at the family stories about their ancestor who helped bring justice to the American frontier. The desert winds still howl through the canyon passes, but they no longer carry the whispered schemes of desperate criminals or the fears of a widow forced to choose between safety and righteousness. Instead, they carry the legacy of a woman who discovered that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't gold or currency, but the courage to do what's right when everything depends on that choice. Margaret's story didn't end with the capture of the Phantom Riders, though many assumed her adventures had concluded with that dramatic gunfight on the moonless spring night. The truth was far more complex and, in some ways, more remarkable than the legend that spread throughout Nevada Territory and beyond. In the months following the raid on her property, Margaret found herself thrust into a role she never could have imagined during her quiet years as a carpenter's wife in Boston. Federal investigators, territorial officials, and even representatives from banks across the western states sought her counsel on matters of frontier security and criminal investigation. The expertise Margaret had inadvertently gained while studying the Phantom Riders' meticulous records made her invaluable to law enforcement agencies struggling to understand how such a sophisticated criminal organization had operated undetected for nearly a decade. She could read the coded notations in the gang's ledgers, interpret their mapping systems, and predict how similar groups might attempt to establish their own networks of corruption and violence. What had begun as a desperate widow's attempt to understand her late husband's unwitting involvement in criminal activity had evolved into a unique form of expertise that proved essential for preventing future organized crime in the developing American West. Marshal Jake Morrison, the honest lawman who had helped orchestrate the final confrontation with the gang, became a regular visitor to Margaret's ranch. Their professional relationship gradually developed into something deeper and more personal, though both approached their growing affection with the cautious wisdom of people who had learned that life could change dramatically without warning. Morrison was a widower himself, having lost his wife to cholera during an epidemic that swept through Carson City 5 years earlier. He understood Margaret's grief and admired her courage in transforming personal loss into public service. The marshal's courtship was conducted with frontier practicality rather than romantic grandeur. He would arrive at the ranch with official documents requiring Margaret's analysis, but their discussions inevitably expanded beyond criminal investigations to encompass their shared experiences of loss, their hopes for the territory's future, and their growing appreciation for each other's company during the long desert evenings. Morrison was 15 years Margaret's senior, weathered by decades of frontier law enforcement, but he possessed a gentleness that reminded her of Thomas, while respecting the independence she had fought so hard to establish. Their wedding, held in the small church that had been built in Dusty Creek with funds from Margaret's reward money, was attended by an unlikely congregation of federal agents, reformed outlaws seeking to make amends for past crimes, and frontier families who had benefited from Margaret's generosity over the years. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted by a circuit preacher who had ridden 60 miles specifically to officiate the marriage of the woman who had become known throughout the territory as the widow who faced down the Phantom Riders. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days and became an annual gathering that drew visitors from across Nevada and California. Margaret's marriage to Marshal Morrison created an unprecedented partnership in frontier law enforcement. While he handled the official duties of territorial justice, she continued her work analyzing criminal patterns and developing strategies for preventing organized crime from taking root in the rapidly growing western settlements. Their combined efforts led to the establishment of the first coordinated law enforcement network in the American West, a system that shared information between territorial authorities and helped prevent the kind of extensive criminal enterprise that the Phantom Riders had successfully operated for so many years. The ranch house that had once concealed a fortune in stolen money became the unofficial headquarters for what historians would later recognize as the foundation of modern American law enforcement cooperation. Federal agents traveling between California and Colorado would stop at the Morrison Ranch to share intelligence and coordinate their investigations with local authorities. Margaret's famous cellar, now converted to its intended purpose of food storage, also served as a secure meeting place where sensitive law enforcement discussions could be conducted without fear of criminal eavesdropping. As Nevada Territory moved toward statehood, Margaret found herself appointed to serve on the commission responsible for establishing the new state's criminal justice system. Her unique experience with organized crime, combined with her practical understanding of frontier conditions, made her an invaluable contributor to the development of laws and procedures that would govern Nevada for generations to come. She was the only woman appointed to the commission, a distinction that caused considerable controversy among more traditional territorial residents, but which proved essential for creating a justice system that recognized the rights and capabilities of all citizens. The commission's work required Margaret to travel extensively throughout the territory, documenting existing law enforcement practices and interviewing sheriffs, marshals, and territorial judges about the challenges they faced in maintaining order across vast distances with limited resources. These journeys, often undertaken in the company of her husband, revealed the enormous diversity of communities that had developed across Nevada. From established mining towns with populations approaching 10,000 to isolated ranching settlements with fewer than 50 residents, each community had developed its own approach to frontier justice. Margaret's reports to the territorial legislature provided the foundation for Nevada's state constitution regarding criminal justice procedures. Her emphasis on coordinated law enforcement, standardized record-keeping, and the importance of preventing organized crime influenced not just Nevada's laws, but served as a model for other territories seeking statehood during the late 19th century. The woman who had stumbled upon a criminal conspiracy while cleaning her kitchen floor had become one of the most influential voices in the development of American law enforcement. The personal cost of Margaret's public service became apparent as she entered her 50s. The constant travel, the emotional weight of analyzing criminal evidence, and the stress of testifying in high-profile cases began to take their toll on her health. Morrison, now appointed as Nevada's first state marshal, worried about his wife's well-being but understood that her work had become essential to maintaining the peace they had fought so hard to establish. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Margaret's greatest contribution to frontier justice required her to constantly immerse herself in the darkest aspects of human behavior. The solution came from an unexpected source. The University of California, recognizing Margaret's unique expertise and her contributions to law enforcement development, offered her a position as the first professor of criminal investigation in their newly established law school. The appointment would allow her to share her knowledge with future lawyers and law enforcement officers, while providing the stability and intellectual stimulation that her restless mind craved. Morrison, eligible for retirement after 30 years of frontier service, welcomed the opportunity to leave the dangerous uncertainties of territorial law enforcement for the more predictable challenges of academic life. Margaret's lectures at the university became legendary among law students and attracted auditors from across the country. Her course on organized crime and frontier justice was the first of its kind offered at any American university, and her textbook on the subject remained the standard reference work for decades. She had a gift for making complex criminal investigations understandable to students while never losing sight of the human cost of crime and the moral responsibility that came with the power to enforce justice. Her students went on to become prosecutors, judges, and law enforcement officers throughout the American West, carrying her teachings into courtrooms and sheriff's offices from Mexico to Canada. The academic environment allowed Margaret to pursue research that had been impossible during her years of active law enforcement consultation. She corresponded with criminologists in Europe, studying how different societies approached the prevention and punishment of organized crime. Her comparative research led to innovations in American law enforcement that included improved methods of evidence collection, standardized procedures for interjurisdictional cooperation, and new approaches to rehabilitation that recognized crime as often being the result of social and economic desperation rather than inherent moral failing. Margaret's influence extended beyond criminal justice to encompass broader social reform movements of the late 19th century. Her experience with the families of both criminals and victims had given her unique insights into the social conditions that fostered crime and the community responses that could prevent it. She became a vocal advocate for public education, women's rights, and economic policies that provided legitimate opportunities for people who might otherwise turn to criminal activity. Her speeches at women's suffrage rallies drew on her frontier experiences to argue that women's participation in public life was essential for creating just and safe communities. The final chapter of Margaret's remarkable life began when she retired from the university at age 65 and returned with Morrison to the Nevada ranch where her extraordinary journey had begun. The house had been extensively renovated over the years, but the basic structure remained unchanged, and the cellar that had once hidden the Phantom Rider's treasure was still used for storing vegetables and preserves. Margaret found peace in returning to the simple rhythms of ranch life while maintaining extensive correspondence with former students, law enforcement officials, and social reformers throughout the country. Margaret Morrison died peacefully in her sleep during the winter of 1923, at the age of 78. Her funeral drew hundreds of mourners from across the American West, including former students who had become prominent judges and attorneys, law enforcement officers whose careers had been shaped by her innovations, and ordinary frontier families whose lives had been touched by her generosity and courage. The service was held in the church she had helped fund in Dusty Creek, now grown into a substantial town with a population approaching 5,000 residents. Her legacy lived on through the institutions she had helped create and the principles she had championed throughout her remarkable career. The coordinated law enforcement network that had grown from her analysis of the Phantom Rider's operations became the foundation for modern American criminal investigation. Her emphasis on preventing crime through social reform influenced generations of progressive lawmakers and judges. Most importantly, her example of moral courage in the face of personal risk inspired countless individuals to choose difficult righteousness over convenient compromise. The old ranch house stood as a monument to Margaret's extraordinary transformation from grieving widow to pioneering criminologist and social reformer. Visitors would often comment on the contrast between the humble frontier dwelling and the remarkable events that had unfolded within its walls. The cellar that had once concealed stolen fortunes and criminal plans had become a symbol of how ordinary people could discover extraordinary purposes when circumstances demanded moral courage and decisive action. Margaret's story became required reading in law schools throughout the country, taught not just as an example of early American criminology, but as an illustration of how individual choices in moments of crisis could shape the development of entire societies. Her decision to alert authorities about the Phantom Rider's plans, despite the personal risks and the temptation of financial gain, had prevented immeasurable suffering while establishing principles of law enforcement cooperation that continued to protect American communities well into the 20th century and beyond. The widowed woman who had received an old ranch house for free had indeed found something in the cellar that changed everything. But the greatest treasure had been her own capacity for moral courage when everything depended on making the right choice.